So we are all very excited to introduce our next speaker, our very own Corey Tucker. So Corey is the Director of Innovation here at Randomization and helps our clients align their programs for maximum success. Corey earned her master's in civil engineering from MIT for her research on technology and policy in transportation. So she knows a thing or two about this industry. We've heard a lot about research and behavioral concepts today, and Corey's here to share some ideas and strategies for exploring some of these to drive commuter programs forward. Take it away, Corey.
All right, thank you so much, Lee, and thank you to my team for putting me after such an incredible speaker. I feel like you've done me a grave disservice, so I really appreciate it. So as Lee mentioned, I'm going to talk to you guys today a little bit about some ideas for how you can make these types of kind of behavioral experiments work for you and your organizations. I know we've heard a lot of great ideas across the board, and I'm sure that some people are sitting there thinking like these are all great and wonderful, but certainly beyond our capacity, maybe beyond our bandwidth. And I want to go through some things that we have done at Randomization and things that you might be able to do, within your organization to help you kind of tackle some of these questions. So what I'm going to do is start by going over a couple kind of the strategies. I'm going to talk a little bit about actually in a different order, RCTs or randomized controlled trials, and also A/B testing. And then I'm going to talk through three of the key kind of aspects that we look at here at Randomization when we take on a project like this, things that we've put in place technologically to enable this kind of testing, and also things that we look at as ways to use tools that we have at our disposal to organize interventions. And then finally, I'm going to go through three examples, things that are either ongoing, stuff that you may have heard of a little bit already today from some of our other panelists, as well as some projects that are kind of in the works. And at the end, I'll obviously open this up for questions. So actually, I'm going to do this in a different order, so we'll skip ahead. So I'm going to start by talking briefly about randomized controlled trials, also referred to as RCTs, if you hear that. RCTs are generally thought of as sort of the gold standard in this type of analysis because they randomize participants into multiple groups where at least one group is a control group. And that means that that group does not necessarily receive the intervention, at least at the time that the intervention has begun. And the reason that this is thought of as the gold standard is that it really kind of demonstrates the efficacy of the intervention itself, not just maybe that the intervention adds something to something already ongoing or is slightly better than an alternative. These are difficult to run, and we recognize that. I'll talk a little bit about one RCT or close to RCT that we have participated with the city of Durham, which you guys heard about a little bit before. But we recognize that RCTs are often kind of a difficult task, especially at an organization, particularly when maybe there are equity concerns about introducing different incentives or different strategies for one group and not introducing them for another. And that's why I want to also talk a little bit about, wow, how do I go back, Matt? I want to talk a little bit about A/B testing. A/B testing, this is kind of a slimmed down version of that, but A/B testing is something that's very traditionally used in the software world. The idea here is rather than randomizing people into groups and having a control, you would randomize participants into groups and introduce two different variants of an intervention. Again, this is often used in software development. It's used for simple things like color schemes and communication techniques and wording. But we can take kind of this idea and apply it even in this transportation behavior sector, where maybe we know we're going to introduce an intervention. A lot of organizations run incentive programs. A lot of organizations do complex communication strategies and other things like that. We know we're going to do those things. So it's not necessarily testing against not having any intervention. Perhaps it's just testing the one style of intervention against the other. And this is a little bit easier to kind of conceptually get your mind around organizing and running at an organization because it doesn't introduce the same kind of concerns about hiding, something that maybe is going to help people from one group, even if it's just for a short period of time. So I think we see this a little bit more often. It's a little bit easier to consider implementing. It's tends to be a little bit less rigorous. This is a little bit more of a kind of an ad hoc technique that we can apply across the board. So moving on from kind of that baseline, I definitely want to kind of get into some of the things that are key components for doing any type of these types of trials, and things that we have really worked hard at RightAmigos to start implementing at a more automated technical level that allows for a faster scale up of a program like this or an experiment like this. And one of those, and the most basic one, I mean, you heard it in both examples, is this idea of randomization. So we have to be able to randomize people into groups in order to introduce these types of interventions and really assess whether or not they have an impact. Because if the groups aren't randomized, there can be tons of different biases in the data that we would then have to account for. So randomization allows us to really feel as if we are applying these interventions to a population that we don't know much about, that hasn't been self-selected or biased in any way. There's a number of ways that we have kind of moved forward with doing this. One of those is kind of just manually randomizing. So we have a large population of people. We're going to actually kind of pull them in and run an experiment on them, even if it's in the RightAmigos system. A great example of this is with the Durham project that we ran. We actually pulled in a large population up front so that we could get a full data set, and all of that randomization was done manually. That said, we have worked really hard to insert some different steps and randomization of different steps and different processes to allow for these types of experiments to kind of flow more seamlessly in maybe a current ongoing program that is happening. So we can also randomize upon registration, or we can do custom implementations. And just to give a quick example of that, Joey mentioned earlier, Joey from Center for Advanced Hindsight, mentioned an ongoing experiment with the City of Austin. Many of you guys know the City of Austin runs an incredibly successful rewards program where they give away administrative leave for taking alternative commutes. As part of that process, we wanted to test some of these other interventions. So we wanted to test the commitment intervention that Joey mentioned, as well as the personalized route intervention. And so in the sign-up process for ADL, we actually inserted randomization there. So we have worked very hard to make it so that we can randomize populations. They don't know that they're being randomized during the normal state of affairs, and then apply interventions on top of that. And that really helps to reduce any bias in the system. Kind of along with that, we had to actually introduce the ability for us to kind of hide that affiliation. So essentially, we are creating these groups of people along the way, and we need them to not know that they have been placed into these groups. We need them to not be able to change what group they've been placed into. We need them to not be able to remove their affiliation from that control or that treatment group. And it's really, really critical that occurs, because that, again, can introduce tremendous amounts of bias into the system. So we have actually created kind of a separate type of network or grouping of users in our system that allows us to hide that affiliation from them, but then apply those interventions to that group of people. And in that way, it does not necessarily introduce any additional biases. And finally, we've kind of looked at different tools that you might be able to use interventions on, things that are at almost anyone's disposal. A lot of people in the TDM industry are running incentives, are doing communications and otherwise. And these are great places to potentially introduce some variations on different interventions. I'll get into a few examples in a little bit more detail, but even on the incentive front, just structuring incentives slightly differently, framing incentives slightly differently, all kinds of things can be tested through these methods. On the communications front, Jessica mentioned timing earlier. Timing is a big deal, and it's easy to imagine a situation where you could pretty easily run the same or very similar styles of communication, but stagger timing with different groups of people in order to really see whether there is a different impact based on that. So to close out, I'm going to jump in quickly to some 3 examples. Again, some of these are in development, some of them are ongoing or currently on pause, but will be ongoing. The first and potentially the most kind of straightforward is this concept of daily rewards versus streak rewards. And they're not necessarily mutually exclusive, obviously, but the question of do people resonate more with getting a reward, a bigger reward for achieving a streak, or do they resonate more with getting a single smaller reward every single day? And so we're actually working with a client now to structure a rewards program. They obviously have some concern about making sure that everyone has access and is eligible for the same kind of general pot of money. You don't want to necessarily introduce a situation where someone could earn more than someone else for a specified behavior. However, we really wanted to kind of test whether or not that kind of small payout daily had more of an impact, or whether that larger payout at the end of the week, if they have completed a streak of 3 or 4 days, would actually have a bigger impact. Example 2, Joey actually mentioned earlier, is this idea of testing the impact of a commuter commitment. We're actually working with a couple different entities on testing this idea. And I apologize if everyone finds it just distracting. Catherine told me it was yesterday, but this is the new world order, and we're not shaking hands to make deals anymore. We're elbow bumping. So, yeah, so the idea here is, does it actually impact a commuter's willingness to follow through or to take the trips that they are thinking about in their head if they make a commitment to doing that? Again, Joey mentioned that we will be doing this with the city of Austin. We factored this into one of those randomizations that I mentioned before. So half of the population that is signing up for this program has the opportunity to make a commitment, half of the population does not. And we will be investigating whether or not that has an impact on the number of trips that they log. And last but not least, this is kind of a more, let's say, extreme version of something in terms of the commitment and the time to development. But the personalized recommendations that we have worked with the City of Durham, the Center for Advanced Hindsight, and now the City of Austin on are showing a decent amount of promise in terms of being able to introduce an intervention that is highly personalized, that recommends how people commute, and then follows up with surveys and or trip logs to assess whether or not a strong impact has been made. And with that, I want to wrap up and open it up for questions. Thank everyone for their time, and also just, as Jessica mentioned, I think at the end of her talk, you can try this too. We definitely are working as hard as we can to make tools available that enable anyone to try their ideas and test them. So feel free to get in touch with your ideas. I'd be happy to talk to anyone about pretty much anything. So come holler at me if you have any interesting things that you'd like to test out.
Thank you, Corey.
Thank you, Matt.
First question that I've got here is, do you have any suggestions around best ways to start collecting additional baseline data to use towards these kinds of interventions?
Surveying. I think I was actually stepped away from my computer for the poll earlier, Matt, but I presume that surveying was the most highly reported data collection mechanism.
Yes, actually, I can give a quick recap for those who weren't on the call for our earlier survey around data acquisition methods that folks on the call have tried. We had 93% of respondents said that they've tried surveys. 49% have used case studies and other external resources. 46% focus groups. 10% have done work with A/B testing, and 7% have worked with randomized control trials.
Yeah, so just to add a little bit, I answered in a one-word answer, and surveying is a broad spectrum. Surveying is really important, and I encourage any organization that I talk to run at least an annual commuter survey. One thing that I would definitely suggest is, every time you do it, consider the questions. And what I mean by that is it's relatively easy to collect baseline data. Everyone sort of knows those questions. If you live in California and you've taken an AQMD survey or given an AQMD survey, you know what that looks like. It looks like, hey, how did you commute last week? That's great information. However, it doesn't tell you anything about maybe which behavioral interventions might actually have an impact on your commuter population. So gathering information from, where they're living and where they're going to, in terms of being able to do something like a personalized route and know that maybe that you have a population that is, has alternatives, all the way through to, sensitivity to time, or sensitivity to money and other things like that. And you don't have to ask those questions necessarily every year, but you could cycle through some of those to kind of get a sense for your population. and understand a little bit more about maybe which intervention styles might actually have an impact.
Awesome answer. Thank you, Corey. We're going to need to move on to the next presenter today, but as always, you have enlightened us.
Thanks, Matt.